Hello and welcome to Live from New Amsterdam, a joint project of the New Amsterdam Project and at New York Historical Society and the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York. This is a program where we give you bite-sized, lunch-sized pieces of history. My guest today is Christian Koot, who is a professor at Towson University. He is the author of two really excellent books. The first is called Empire at the Periphery, and the second is a biography of a map in motion, Augustine Herman's Chesapeake. So welcome, Christian. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. And I gotta say, real quickly, it's such a delight to be at a event co-sponsored by the New Netherlands Institute and New York Historical Society, because both institutions have been instrumental to my scholarship. New York Historical Society gave me the first fellowship that I ever got to start working on my dissertation way back in 2003, and the publications and the conferences of the New Netherlands Institute have been absolutely vital. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And everyone in the audience, while we're talking, just remember that you can use the Q&A feature to ask questions. Feel free to submit those questions as we're talking, and we'll get to them probably in the last 8 to 10 minutes of the discussion. Okay, we're here to talk about mapping. What can you tell us about the Dutch tradition of mapping? I mean, this is something that is considered quite unique, I think, in the early modern European mapping tradition.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things about Dutch mapping is to think about the kinds of mapping that sort of came together in the 17th century. So there really are two important traditions of making what we think of as maps in the 17th century that really had a home in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. So one of those is navigation maps, right? Maps that were used to move around. And when we think of maps, I think we often think of using them that way today. But in fact, in the 17th century, in the early modern period, most sailors didn't really use maps to sail. What they used was combinations of compass readings, um, compass bearings, the depth of shipping lanes, the speed that they were moving, as well as maps of the openings of waterways, of rivers, of ports, and they sort of used all that information together to move along the coastline and to find the places they were going. So one of the traditions that begins to emerge in the 16th and 17th century as Dutch merchants begin not just plying the waterways of Europe, but beginning to explore elsewhere, right? Eventually to the west and to the east, they begin to produce lots of these kinds of maps. So that's sort of one tradition. And most of that tradition we don't really have anymore. Most of those maps were manuscript maps. That is, they were drawn with pen and paper. They were sketched by navigators and captains as they moved. And most of those are lost to us. The second set of maps are the maps that we tend to think of maps from this period. And those are these gorgeous, beautifully engraved maps, right? So one of the things that's different about these maps is they're engraved. They're not pen on paper, but most of them are engraved copper plates that are then printed, and many of them then beautifully colored with watercolors. And this tradition also began to rise in the 17th century in the Netherlands, largely as a result of immigrants fleeing places like Bruges, as in Antwerp, as the southern Netherlands were invaded by the Spanish. And these people ended up in Amsterdam, a place with burgeoning commerce and a burgeoning print tradition, and they began to produce some absolutely gorgeous maps, right? And these are many of the maps that we find in the great map collections today. And they made both sort of wall-size maps, so picture of Vermeer painting and the maps of the Dutch Republic in the background in those paintings, but they also made these gorgeous atlases. Then we're talking people here like Willem Blauw and the Hondas family. And these are maps really of Europe, of cities, and increasingly of the places that Dutch merchants went. So maps of the East Indies, maps eventually of the Americas as well. So these are sort of these two major traditions. Now, there is some interplay between them, right? Those navigational kinds of maps end up as some of the core data that's at the heart of these larger maps, but they have really different purposes, right? Those large atlases sort of had commercial importance, right? They were consumer objects. The sort of burgeoning upper middle class and elite in the Dutch Republic wanted to buy these things to look at with wonder, right? They could experience traveling the world by turning the pages. They could use them as they read the news or read history books to understand what's happening in other places. They're also political, right? They were mapping and sort of digesting all these new places Dutch merchants were going and saying, these are part of our world, giving them new names, incorporating those places in their worldview.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you talk about those hand-drawn maps because you see them and you kind of think, wow, how did this work? How did they, they it'll be like some coastline feature, like a big mountain and then a little mountain, and then you know what I mean? And it's stunning how they were able to use those to actually arrive in a place.
Yeah, right. And they are one, right? I mean, most sailors in this period sail by dead reckoning, right? That is, they sail by going in a straight line, often along the coastline, using a compass and looking at the coastline to say, okay, this is where I am. And it is pretty remarkable if they ever got anywhere.
Yes, and yeah, I just think I mean, that there was an advantage to hugging the coast. You just look at your pictures going all the way
Right.
down. Um, So what did the Dutch bring of this making tradition to the Americas
Yeah, I
in the
mean, so
17th
they bring
century?
both parts. And I think perhaps maybe most directly, and this is once again one of those interesting things. The most important Dutch maps of the Americas are largely lost to us, right? And that's because they're those navigation maps. So they're people, you know, beginning with the first Dutch explorers to the North American coast. They begin to sketch the coastline, right? This is part of what captains and pilots and navigators did, is they sketched the coastline as they traveled. This helped not only them in the future, but this helped them figure out where exactly they were. And they begin to bring these maps back to the to the Netherlands. And there, many of these maps begin to get processed into what become those sort of display maps, and they get put together. So part of this was institutionalized. So the Dutch West India Company, which in many ways directed settlement and exploration in North America, certainly by the 1620s. One of the instructions that they gave to the ships that they sent out was to bring back maps. And then they went to a centralized office. And there's a man by the name of Johannes Vigboons who reprocessed a lot of these kinds of maps into maps of waterways. So incredible maps of what becomes the Delaware River, incredible maps of the harbor of what is Manhattan and Staten Island, that region, as well as, and interestingly enough, one of the first good maps of the James River we have is actually a Dutch map from the 1610s, drawn by Johannes Vigboons from Dutch merchants who had sailed into the James River, the English call it the James River.
I didn't know that was one
Yeah,
of, oh,
I
that's
mean,
so
it's an
interesting.
incredible map. 1614, I think, is the date of that map. And by the way, I should have said at the start, listeners can find incredible numbers of these maps because of the efforts that libraries have taken to put them online. One of the great places to start is the Library of Congress, which has those Vigboons maps. These maps are called pass carts or passage charts, and that's what they were. They were designed to allow you to move along a waterway, right? And this comes from, and this is, I think, an important part of this sort of Dutch tradition, right? I mean, one of the things that they're doing, of course, in North America is setting up trading posts to trade furs with Native Americans, to quickly begin to trade with English colonists as well, right? Which is why they're in the Chesapeake and in New England. And these maps are incredibly detailed, right? So they have elaborate shading, which allows you to tell the depths of waterways. They have little numbers written in that tell you how deep the water is at different times. They have intersecting what are called rum lines, which are lines of compass bearing, so that one can use this map on a very large scale to move in and out of these waterways. So you can look at these maps at the Library of Congress. It's also worth looking at the New York Public Library and the John Carter Brown Library to find a lot of these maps. So these passage charts then make their way back to the Netherlands, and they serve almost like a sort of a lending library for the West India Company. Instructions for new traders that are heading out in the name of the West India Company are given lists of these maps, and we know that they're carrying these maps with them. They're also then becoming part of the maps that make up the printed maps that the Dutch are using to show their extensive colonization as well, right? So there is sort of an interlinking of those couple of traditions.
Yeah, I just want to mention, since you mentioned the maps, that I believe that Henry Hudson, when he was stopped in England on the way back from his exploration of Hudson's Bay and the Hudson River and everything like that, I think one of the things that was at issue was the maps that he had drawn of the area and whether the Dutch would be able to get them back. This was in the service of the East India Company, Dutch East India Company. But so, I mean, I think something to underscore in what you're saying is really that people didn't know the geography and that these maps were actually super valuable and super useful, and that controlling the knowledge of what was happening was really important. So it's not like today, you lose a map, you buy another map or whatever, or you have it on your phone. It doesn't really matter. For them, it was central to gather all these maps into one place.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the, going back to your first question, which is why is it that it's Amsterdam in the 17th century that emerges as this great map producing place? And one of the reasons for that is, even though the Portuguese, for example, have more sort of cartographic knowledge at this moment and have frankly been doing it longer, they are incredibly secretive about the maps that they're holding on to. So they don't want that information out, whereas it's at least initially, it's a little less centralized in the Dutch example, and that information becomes more widely available.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we can also compare the East India Company and the West India Company to this. And the East India Company was like pretty eager to keep all of the mapping secret. I mean, I think the West India Company was too. They just kind of couldn't keep it all under wraps. So you have specifically worked in your second book on a map by Augustine Herman's.
Yeah,
Can you tell us about that map specifically and why
sure.
it's
It's a map is
interesting?
called Virginia and Maryland, that is, as it is planted and inhabited. And you can Google that if you want to take a look at this map. And one of the interesting things about this map, and I'll tell you a little bit about Herman to make sense of why it matters. So Augustine Herman is one of these sort of amazing 17th century globetrotters. He was born probably in Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, in the 1620s. His father, we don't actually know that much about his early years, but he ended up in Amsterdam or somewhere in the Dutch Republic. And by 1644, he arrived in New Amsterdam, working as a young man in his early 20s for a Dutch fur trading concern, Peter Gabre. And Herman was, like many young men arriving in New Amsterdam in this moment, an agent of European traders, but also someone that was sort of on the make. And almost very quickly, Herman begins not trading not just for his Amsterdam backers, but for himself. By 1655, so within a decade, he's now already traveled to the Caribbean on behalf of the Dutch West India Company. He's been to what is today the Delaware River, what the Dutch called the South River, their fur trading posts there. He had traveled to probably New England by this moment as well. And he begins to trade, perhaps most importantly, to the Chesapeake in the 1650s. And he quickly begins to buy land in both Maryland and Virginia. He partners with both English and Dutch merchants living in that region. And by the late 1650s, he is one of a group of New Amsterdam traders that specializes in bringing tobacco from these English colonies to New Amsterdam and re-exporting it to the Dutch Republic, and bringing mostly Dutch manufactured goods to supply these English planters at a moment in which English merchants essentially can't fulfill their needs. And it's at this moment that sort of life changes a little bit. Petrus Stuyvesant, who's the director of New Amsterdam, of the Dutch West India Company New Amsterdam, sent Herman to Maryland to negotiate about the border between New Netherlands and Maryland. And this is the border in what is today the Delmarva Peninsula, which was claimed by both the Dutch and claimed by both the English. At that meeting, Herman gets the idea that one of the problems with these overlapping claims is there's not a really good enough map of the Chesapeake. So he tells Stuyvesant, I'm happy to draw you a map. And Stuyvesant ignores him. He then wrote to Philip Calvert, who he had met on this trip, who was the sort of acting governor of Maryland. And the Calverts take him up on the offer. And he produces the map that was eventually published about 15 years later by the 1670s in Amsterdam. I'm sorry, in London. And what is so interesting about this map for me and for this book is the way that Herman captures the Chesapeake, because what we see here is that Dutch navigational, seeing land from water, making maps that are about access, moving in and out. He captures that view of the Chesapeake. And even though, right, so this map has sort of north at the right, which is pretty common in maps in the period. And even though there are all these sort of symbols of English authority, there's a big coat of arms at the top, which is the coat of arms of Great Britain. Cecilia Calvert's coat of arms is on the map. All the names are English names, things that Calvert would have liked. The underlying cartographic data is really all about moving in and out of this place. And previous maps of the Chesapeake and English maps of the Chesapeake had really been about land and about claiming land for the English, drawing clear borders between what's English and what's not. And Ehrman's map sort of blurs all that. And I think, and what I argue in the book, and I think what the map captures is this idea that you control and occupy space not by claiming land, but rather by claiming access to that land. And that's what Herman captures. So if you zoom in on this map and once again, the Library of Congress has a great high resolution image of it. If you zoom in, you can see all of those elements that are really common on these Dutch passage charts, these Dutch pass cards. And it's really that tradition that Herman comes from, which makes sense. He likely learned his mapping technique in the Netherlands, right, from his experience as a trader working for Dutch merchants, and that he sort of puts that together. So what we get in this map is a picture not of the English Chesapeake, but rather, I think, of Herman's sort of Anglo-Dutch world, the world that he lived in as a merchant moving between these places.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that and I think this is something that comes out in the larger history of Dutch map making, that it's always about the water. How do you get into something? How do you navigate? How do you get to trade with people? So it's so interesting that he incorporated that view so strongly into the map, even with all these English things. Does he have any indigenous place names or does he pay attention to that at all or not
Yeah,
really?
he does. And I'm glad you asked that, because it's worth thinking a little bit about how someone like Herman would have made one of these maps. So he does. So in what is today New Jersey, he has the presence of Lenape people. He also has some Lenape villages in what is today the Delmarva Peninsula, the presence of the Susquehannock, who had become important traders in sort of the, what is today the northern part of the Chesapeake Bay, where the Susquehanna River opens into it. He's got the presence of those places as well. So how do you make a map like this, right? And I think that's an important thing. And the way you make a map like this is by synthesizing dozens, hundreds of tiny little maps, right? So as a merchant, Herman would have drawn this coastline, right? Just like that Dutch navigational tradition, he would have kept track of how you get to various places by compass bearing, estimates of distance using speed and angles, right? Essentially using trigonometry, together with sketching the coastline. And if you accumulate enough of that data, you can begin to draw a map like this. He also, of course, would have traded these maps with other merchants, right? Other merchants that he was working with and planters he was working with would have routinely exchanged this kind of information. And there are, in court records and some other kinds of accounts, there are little hints that this is happening as well. He also probably had Native American informants. Herman, as early as the 1640s and 50s, clearly as any sort of early European colonists would have interacted with indigenous people of various kinds. And it's not unlikely that indigenous informants helped him, as we know helped lots of other people draw maps from Hudson on down. to John Smith, to others. So almost invariably, he would have had indigenous knowledge helping shape at least some of the map.
Um, That's so interesting. I had never really thought about the trading of the drawn maps between merchants. And actually, we talk a lot about how merchants needed a lot of training to do their jobs in, numeracy and account books and things like that. But to think of part of their job actually as drawing maps too is very the world of the merchant is ever expanding and,
Yeah, and
multifaceted.
it is. And one of the things that's interesting is, so in writing this book, I read there are all these essentially navigation manuals, right, that teach people how to navigate. And one of the things that comes out in those navigation manuals is that they're written for merchants. They're not written just for captains or for pilots, but one of the things that they almost invariably say is that merchants should know how to do all the same things that captains do, and they should keep track of those things. Yeah.
I think we're going to go into a little bit of Q&A. So one of the essential questions here is where can people see the maps that we're talking about? So obviously, you've already mentioned the Library of Congress, where you can see, I think, the Blau maps and the Vinkbones maps. You can also go to the Rijksmuseum's website. They have a good collection. If you go to the National Archives website in The Hague, the National Archives, you can see early hand-drawn maps of New Netherland, just a few. Again, don't expect to see hundreds of maps, but there's a few hand-drawn ones that you can see. And anywhere else we should point people to?
One of the great collections is the John Carter Brown Library. And they have a great sort of interactive map viewer that allows you to see incredible detail. And there, what you will find is maps really from around the world, but they have a lot of the Blau maps and the Hundis maps. A lot of the early modern period is very strong in that collection.
But again, we should emphasize, I think, what Kristen mentioned in the beginning, which is that some of the maps we wish we had, we just don't have. That is, these hand-drawn ones. You're not going to find any of those, perhaps because of all the trading and they were handled and all that stuff. So unfortunately, that's more of a speculation, reason speculation, but I don't think we're going to find many of those.
You can see their traces, right? And I think that's an important thing. So if you look at the Vigbones maps, right, what you're seeing is the combination of those things. So you can almost imagine their existence.
Yeah. We have another question, which is, are there any maps that are notoriously inaccurate from the period?
So I love that question because it gets at two really important things. One is, what does accurate mean, right? So one of the things that's interesting about that, right, is at the sort of towards the middle and end of the 18th century, right, as the sort of scientific revolution matures, we get in the West a new idea of accuracy that's tied to science in new ways, which changes the way we think of as maps, right? That is, if they can't get us to exactly where we want them or picture things exactly how we think they look, then they're somehow inaccurate. In the 17th century, that didn't exist yet about maps, right? Maps are sort of understood to be impressions of places. And if one was most interested in navigation, they didn't just use maps, right? They used other kinds of things. So what maps do from this period, even if, for example, they picture Manhattan, Staten Island, the Chesapeake Bay, not in the way that we would tell if we looked at a Google map today, what they're doing is capturing how they imagined these things look, right? And that's a really important thing. And so accurate doesn't really get at the sort of lived reality that what these maps represent. Now, that being said, yes, I mean,
yes, give us your most inaccurate map. Let's hear.
Well, I mean, so if one of the things I write in the book a lot about is comparing the very famous John Smith map of the Chesapeake to Augustine Herman's map of the Chesapeake, right? And one of the things that Smith's map would allow us to believe is that the waterways of the Chesapeake are not as accessible as, in fact, they were in this period. I guess one of the other things I would say is that, as good as the Herman map was, and it was very good, as soon as it was created, it was inaccurate. And the reason for that is that one of the things it's got is all these shipping depths and tells you, where sandbars are and where the channels are. Well, as we know, all it took was a hurricane and all those things were different anyway. So I'm going to dodge again. Now, a lot of these
How long
maps.
did it take for his map to be superseded by another map that was?
It's a great question. It took a long time. So, one of the things that happens to it is it gets incorporated into this thing called it gets incorporated into this atlas, which is this sort of becomes this sort of what's the right word for it? Maybe this sort of reference material for maps of the Atlantic in the British world, and it's in that that collection of maps really until the 1760s and 1770s. So for almost a century, and
So
it's
for
really
centuries.
not until right about the time of the American Revolution that there's a map of the Chesapeake and the Delaware River that are quote unquote more accurate and sort of begins to disappear.
Do we find people mentioning that they have used his map, in the 100 years after it was published?
So that's a great question. So one of the neat things about this map is it's actually an incredibly rare map. There are only 5 copies left today. And the reason for that is there are probably only about 100, 150 ever produced. And one of the unique things about it is it's really big. So it's a 4-sheet map. So it's almost 3 feet by 3.5 feet large, and it's 4 different pieces
Wow.
that have been put together. Yeah, it's a massive map, and in fact, it was too big. And that's because it's at that scale that would allow navigation. So that's sort of why it's so detailed. So what happens almost immediately to it once it's published in London is the data gets shrunk and incorporated into what we might today call pirated versions of it, but they wouldn't have thought about it that way. But it gets incorporated into other maps, and it becomes then reproduced over and over again in dozens and dozens of maps across the late 17th, early 18th century. So while people don't refer to the Herman map, we know through the use of it in other maps that people are paying attention to it, even if it gets sort of cut off from him and who he was.
That brings me to another question, which is something it never occurred to me to ask you before is, so you've seen the map laid out in person in all of its 3-foot by 3-foot glory?
Yeah, I've seen every copy of it. So John Carter Brown has one. The Library of Congress has one. The National Archive in Paris has one. The British Library has one, and there's one at Magdalen College in Cambridge. And they're gorgeous. All of them are gorgeous. The one at Magdalen College in Cambridge is actually the best because it was never put together. So the other ones have all been put together and mounted on linen so that it's sort of one big map. Whereas the
So they
one
have
at
to
Magdalen
bring
College,
you this huge piece if you
well, it's
request
all
it.
folded up. It
Okay.
does fold up
It does.
into the
Okay.
4 pieces, and you can unfold it. But the one at Magdalen College was bound by Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist from London, who bought it soon after it was published, was bound in a volume of maps that he has. And it is gorgeous. It is like it has never seen daylight. When you open it, the paper is white. The engraving lines are crisp. It's pretty amazing. Whereas the other ones are much more weathered, I would say.
Okay. They were used by their owners,
That's right.
perhaps. Um, that's fascinating. Okay, we have so people in the chat want to know how we spell the names of these people. So let's just end there. So can you just spell Augustine Herman so people can look up this map if they want
Yeah,
to
his
when we're
last name
done?
is Herrmans. There are lots of different spellings, but that's the spelling that's on the map. So it's
And
Augustine.
let's say again the name of the map.
The map is Virginia. What's the full name? Virginia in Maryland as it is planted and inhabited. And
Okay, so people are now wanting to see this map now that we've talked it up so much. So that should help anyone who wants to see it. And if anyone in who's here has trouble finding it and wants to see it, you can just email New York Historical Society, the program, the link, the email that's on the registration, and we will direct you and help you find it. If you want to. And the last question we also have is, where can people see these maps in person rather than online? So I assume you can request that at these maps at the Library of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to register as a reader, but anyone can do that, and you can request these maps. And the Library of Congress, for example, lays out how you do that. The same's true about the New York Public Library. Now, I will say some of these archives that have digitized amounts of their collection have partly done them for preservation reasons. So there may be times where if maps are digitized, they might be unwilling to allow you to see them in person. So, but their websites are pretty good about explaining that.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Christian. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We'll be back on May 30th, and I will be interviewing Russell Shorto, the curator among his other jobs and duties, but the curator of the Costello Plan installation at New York Historical Society. So we'll be talking more about maps next month. So hopefully these will form a dialogue. Thank you so much, Christian, and
Okay, thank you for
talk to you
having me.
soon.